Literacy has a history. Our individual life histories contain many literacy events from early childhood onwards, which the present is built upon. We change and as children and adults are constantly learning about literacy. There are two senses of historical change, that of the individual's growth and development and that of the whole culture over a longer time period. We need a way of talking about literacy which takes account of these two notions and relates them in which is dynamic and can deal with change. And both of them, current practices, are created out of the past. The first sense is the change of an individual's individual person's life. Every person has a history, and for the discussion here, every person has a literacy history. This goes back to early childhood and the first encounters with literacy practices and home literacy events. It continues with involvement in community and school practices and on into adulthood and its varying and changing demands. At any point in time, a person's choices are based on the possibilities provided by their past experiences. Just as our view of literacy is dependent on our view of language, it's also dependent on our view of learning. Learning is something which takes place all the time. All activities involve learning. It's not limited to official sittings in a classroom. It's not something which only children do. We change throughout our lives, and as children and adults as children and adults are constantly learning about literacy, and that change is key to learning. There are several ways in which literacy is bound up with changes in people's lives. Firstly, people read and write at particular times in their lives. The demands of life change. There are times in people's lives when they need to read and write more, and times when they need to read and write less. New demands can result from changes at work, or they can arise from changes in people's personal lives. For example, parents may experience changing demands when their young children grow up and go to school. In addition, people want to make changes in their lives, and reading and writing can enable them to make such changes. A broad view of learning is needed, which provides a way of connecting up preschool literacy and adult literacy campaigns, and which also goes beyond these settings into everyday life. We need to account for how literacy is acquired, not just in schools and by children, but in everyday life. Not just here and now, but in other cultures and in other times. It's important to link up learning by adults and learning by children, and to have a clear idea of the importance and limitations of schooling. People learn in their everyday lives, and not enough attention has been paid to this everyday or vernacular literacy, this everyday literacy. We learn new literacies at work. We learn new literacies in the places where we may worship. We learn new literacies simply by participating in forums like Facebook, Google+, text messaging, all types of online participation. one implication of this view of learning is that children are not incomplete beings and adults complete human beings. Literacy makes sense to anyone at any one time. Whether a 4-year-old child, a person from another culture or another historical period, their literacy makes sense to them. Notions of incomplete literacy or restricted literacy aren't useful within this framework. There are not component skills which can be added separately like building blocks to make a complete building. And of course, it's still true that people may want to change and extend their literacies, and this can be equally true for teenagers, adult basic education students, and professional writers. Finally, in this view of learning, learning comes from social interaction. But it's also built upon foundations which are part of our human endowment. Our intelligence, our innate potentialities. An ecological or a social approach is neither innatist, something completely within us, innate, or environmentalist, something completely outside of us. It's about the dynamic interaction of the two, how people fit into the environment, how they form it, and are formed by it. So I'm not putting forward a purely environmental or social position. The mind is socially constructed upon innate potentials or potentialities. And I choose the word potentialities carefully because I think the word capacities have been misleading. One more point about literacy and history, and that is literacy events and practices have a social history. So I talked about an individual history, now I want to talk about a social history. And that second sense of history is that of change of the whole culture. With literacy, this goes back 5,000 years to the origin of writing, and there have been many developments in this long stretch of time. And I hope what becomes evident, the history of literacy raises many questions about the scripts in existence today, about cultures without literacy, and about the relationship of literacy and thought. It can provide some insights into areas as diverse as the learning of literacy, levels of literacy in society, literacy in technological change, literacy in power relations. But recent history should make it clear how current practices are based on the past and how they're not inevitable and unchangeable, but have developed out of past practices. Issues such as disputes about levels of literacy in schools, the importance of popular literacies, the rise of elite notions of literature and the literary, can all be illuminated by examining recent history. We need to account for the origins of literacy in the distant historical past, as well as to understand the closer historical basis of contemporary literacy. It's important to integrate these ideas, bringing together learning with an understanding of cognition and historical change. So, the two notions of literacy, that of the individual and that of the whole culture, come together at several points. For example, as we read about in Literacy in American Lives, when people pass on culture from generation to generation, you can see how generations passed on literacy practices. how there are links with the past, with the future. And historically, there are these connections with earlier generations of people. And in contemporary study of everyday uses of literacy, we've documented ways in which people have want life to be different for their own children. And these people are passing on a culture in a changing environment. And this is important in an important way in which the culture and literacy practices change. Another situation where the two aspects of change in history come together is with, quite obviously, current rapid social change, where new technologies and political changes are changing the demands on people. And we see this in literacy in American lives. New social practices are give different possibilities and constraints, so that in the new workplace, people have to monitor their work and to keep records in new ways, as well as changing the ways they communicate. Some social changes increase literacy demands. Some reduce literacy demands. Think about our modern technology and how we decide to send messages to people. Do we want to send a thank you note by an email, a text message, or a card, and actually put a stamp on it and put it in the mail? Do we want to make a phone call? Do we want to Skype? Do we want to, and even without email, just all forms of communication, we have to decide what form we want that message to take. So the path to a choice in any particular instance is very complicated, involving availability, cost, technical ability, reliability, and social factors, pragmatic factors, rules of politeness, which are changing so quickly, along with the technology. So these possibilities are all changing the basis of communication and human relationships. And hopefully, examining examples from the past, such as the spread of printing, can illuminate current changes.